The officer didn't ask for her name. He didn't ask for her registration. The first thing Constable Wade Okafor said when he walked up to the driver's side window of her car was, "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am, now." It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October, and Major General Chiamaka Ferreira Obi had just driven 40 minutes from CFB Trenton to pick up her mother from a medical appointment in Belleville, Ontario. She was driving her own car, a dark blue Lexus, 7 years old, nothing flashy, and she was wearing civilian clothes because she had taken personal leave that morning. She had a Tim Hortons cup in the cup holder. There was a library book on the back seat. She was 3 kilometers from the clinic when the cruiser lights appeared behind her. She pulled over immediately on a wide residential street, lined with maple trees that had already turned. She kept her hands on the wheel. She lowered the window. She waited. Okafor had been joined by his partner, Constable Gerald Price, who came around to the passenger side and stood with his arms crossed, looking at the interior of the car with a kind of studied skepticism, as though he was already composing a report in his head. "Do you know why we stopped you?" Okafor asked. "I don't," she said. "Can you tell me?" "We received a call about a vehicle matching this description in the area. There's been some break-ins on this block." Chiamaka Ferreira Obi looked at him steadily. She was 51 years old. She had served in the Canadian Armed Forces for 28 years. She had done 2 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Mali. She had been posted to NATO headquarters in Brussels. She had sat across negotiating tables from foreign defense ministers. She was not a person who frightened easily, and she was not a person who raised her voice when she didn't need to. "I'm on my way to pick up my mother from the Belleville Medical Center," she said. "Her appointment was at 2. We're going to need you to step out of the vehicle." "Am I being detained?" Okafor glanced at his partner. Something passed between them, not quite a look of alarm, more like confirmation, like she had said exactly the kind of thing that made them more certain, not less, about whatever they had already decided. "Step out of the vehicle, please." She stepped out. She stood on the sidewalk in her dark green jacket, and her jeans, her car keys in one hand, her phone in the other. Price had come around to her side now, and both of them were close enough that she could have touched either one without extending her arm. "We're going to need to see some ID." She produced her driver's license from her wallet and handed it over. Okafor looked at it, then passed it to Price, who walked it back to the cruiser. He stood beside her on the sidewalk, not speaking, watching her with the patient, unhurried certainty of someone who has never once in his professional life had reason to doubt his own judgment. A woman walking a golden retriever passed on the other side of the street. She looked over. She kept walking. Price came back from the cruiser. He handed the license back to Okafor. Another exchange, this one quicker. "We're going to need to search your vehicle," Okafor said. "No," she said. "Ma'am, you don't have grounds. I haven't consented, and you don't have a warrant. If you believe you have reasonable grounds, you can tell me what they are." The tone in which she said this was not aggressive. It was not emotional. It was the tone of someone who had spent decades in institutions built entirely on hierarchy and procedure, and who understood, at a bone-deep level, how those institutions worked and what their rules actually said. Okafor took a breath. He was in his early 30s. He'd been with the Belleville Police Service for 6 years. He was not a bad person in any simple sense of that word. But he had stopped this car for a reason he would struggle later to articulate precisely. He had seen a black woman driving alone in a residential neighborhood in the middle of the afternoon, and something had registered, and he had reached for the radio. "There have been break-ins," he said again. "I heard you the first time," she said. What happened next took less than 4 minutes, and those 4 minutes would be reviewed, extensively and in detail, by 3 separate bodies over the course of the following months. Okafor reached for his handcuffs. "I'm placing you under investigative detention," he said. "Turn around, please." She looked at him. She did not look frightened. She did not look angry, not in the way he might have expected. She looked at him with a clarity that he would later describe, in one of his written statements, as unsettling. "You're making a mistake," she said. "Turn around, please." She turned around. She put her hands behind her back. The cuffs clicked into place. A man pulling out of a driveway 30 meters away stopped his car, rolled down his window, and stared. She stood on the sidewalk in handcuffs, and she said, quietly but clearly, "I need to make a phone call." "You're not under arrest," Price said, apparently believing this resolved something. Then you can't prevent me from making a call, she said. Or are you going to tell me I'm wrong about that too? There was a pause. Okafor Ndi nodded once. She could not reach her phone herself with her hands behind her back, so Price, with visible reluctance, took it from her jacket pocket and held it in front of her face to unlock it with Face ID. She told him the number to call. It was not a local number. It was not a number most people in Belleville would have recognized. It was the direct line to the office of the Chief of the Defense Staff at National Defense Headquarters in Ottawa. Price dialed. He held the phone up so she could speak. The conversation lasted approximately 90 seconds. Price's expression changed during those 90 seconds, in a way that would have been, under different circumstances, almost interesting to watch. It moved through several distinct stages: mild impatience, then confusion, then something that might be called dawning, then something that can only be described as the particular dread of a man who has just understood, fully and irreversibly, what he has done. He lowered the phone when she was finished speaking. He looked at Okafor Ndi. Okafor Ndi looked at him. She's. Price started and then stopped, as if saying the words out loud might make them more true, and he wasn't ready for that yet. Take the cuffs off, she said. They took the cuffs off. Major General Chiamaka Ferreira Obi had been appointed to her rank 14 months earlier, making her one of the most senior black women in the history of the Canadian Armed Forces. She had been awarded the Meritorious Service Medal and the Commander's Commendation. She had testified before the Standing Committee on National Defense. She had spent the better part of 3 decades doing things that most people never have occasion to do, in places most Canadians couldn't easily find on a map, in service of a country that, sometimes, on a Tuesday afternoon on a residential street in Belleville, failed to extend to her even its most basic courtesies. She picked up her mother from the clinic 45 minutes late. Her mother, Ngozi Ferreira Obi, was 81 years old, and she had been waiting in the lobby of the medical center with her walker and her coat, and the unwavering patience of a woman who had been waiting for things her entire life. Traffic? Her mother asked. Something like that, Chiamaka said. They drove home. They had dinner. Chiamaka Ferreira Obi waited until her mother was settled and the dishes were done, before she sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and her laptop and began to write. What followed was not immediate. It did not happen overnight. It did not have the clean, satisfying speed of a scene in a film. This is the thing that tends to get lost when these stories are told. The real version is slow and procedural and requires someone with the will and the resources and the knowledge to push through a system that is, at its most fundamental level, designed to absorb complaints and return them neutralized. Chiamaka Ferreira Obi had the will. She had spent 28 years learning the system from the inside. She knew exactly which doors existed and which ones were actually unlocked, and she knew how to walk through them without making a sound that could be dismissed. She filed a formal complaint with the Belleville Police Services Professional Standards Unit. She filed a separate complaint with the Ontario Civilian Police Commission. She contacted the Office of the Federal Minister of National Defence to flag the incident as potentially relevant to the ongoing review of diversity and inclusion in federal institutions. She did not go to the media, at least not immediately. She did not post anything on social media. She prepared a detailed written account of the stop, time-stamped and documented, including the names of both officers, their badge numbers, which she had memorized during the stop itself, and the names of 2 civilian witnesses she had identified. The professional standards investigation was opened within 72 hours. It would later emerge that Constable Wade Okafor Ndi had a prior complaint in his file, a 2019 incident involving a traffic stop of a young black man in the north end of the city that had been flagged, investigated, and ultimately resolved with a finding of unsubstantiated. The complaint had not affected his record in any formal sense. It had simply sat there, waiting. It was no longer waiting. The review took 4 months. During that time, both Okafor Ndi and Price were placed on administrative reassignment. Their sergeant, a man named Douglas Helwick, who had reviewed and signed off on both officers' incident reports from the afternoon in question, reports that described the stop as routine and the subject as uncooperative, was included in the scope of the investigation. The incident reports would later be described, in the Commission's written findings, as containing material omissions and characterizations inconsistent with the available evidence, which is the language that oversight bodies use when they mean something more plainly damning, but are required, by convention, to say it carefully. The security footage from a residential camera mounted on a house 40 meters down the street had captured the entire stop. It had captured Chiamaka Ferreira Obi, standing with her hands at her sides, answering questions calmly. It had captured the moment Okafor Ndiaye reached for the handcuffs. It had captured the expression on the face of the man in the driveway. Across the street, a middle-aged white man named Terence Bullock, who would later submit a witness statement to the commission, describing what he had seen, including his certainty, formed in the moment, that the woman in handcuffs had done nothing wrong. Sergeant Douglas Helwick retired before the investigation concluded. He submitted his retirement paperwork on a Friday afternoon and cleaned out his desk over the weekend. Constable Gerald Price resigned. Constable Wade Okafor Ndiaye did not resign. He waited for the process to complete. The commission found that the stop had lacked reasonable grounds, that the decision to apply handcuffs had been disproportionate and unsupported, and that the subsequent incident reports had misrepresented the conduct of the subject. The Belleville Police Service Chief of Police accepted the findings. Okafor Ndiaye was dismissed from the service in June, 7 months after a Tuesday afternoon in October, when he had seen a black woman driving alone in a residential neighborhood and reached for his radio. There's a comment that sometimes appears under stories like this one. You've probably seen it, maybe even thought it yourself. It goes something like this. Good, but she only got justice because she was a general. What about everyone else? It is a fair question. It is, in many ways, the most important question, and it deserves an honest answer rather than a reassuring one. Chiamaka Ferreira Obi knew this. She said so directly in an interview she gave 6 months after the investigation concluded to a journalist at the Ottawa Citizen. She said that she had resources, institutional, legal, social, that most people in her situation do not have. She said that she knew which complaint forms to file and where to file them and how to follow up, and that this knowledge was itself a form of privilege that she had not earned in a parking lot, but in 28 years of learning how systems work and where their pressure points are. She said that the outcome she received should be the baseline, not the exception. She said it plainly, without drama, in the same tone she had used on that sidewalk in October. She also said something else, and this is the part that tends not to get quoted as often. She said that when she was standing on that sidewalk with her hands behind her back, she was not thinking about her rank or her medals or who she could call. She was thinking about her mother waiting in the lobby of a clinic 4 kilometers away, and about whether she was going to make it in time. She was thinking about the 1,000 ordinary things that make up an ordinary afternoon, and about how many times, in how many ways those ordinary things can be interrupted for people who look like her for reasons that have nothing to do with break-ins on a residential street. The rank didn't protect her from the moment. It only gave her the tools to document it afterward. There is a version of this story that ends with a courtroom and a gavel, with a dramatic reveal in front of a crowd, with the officers' faces falling in real time as a commanding officer reads out her service record. That is the version that films prefer, and it is satisfying in the way that tidy things are satisfying. The real version ended with Chiamaka Ferreira Obi returning to her work. It ended with a set of written findings published in a PDF on the Ontario Civilian Police Commission's website. It ended with 2 men who are no longer police officers, and one who retired on a Friday afternoon, and a witness statement from a man named Terence Bullock, who had stopped his car in a driveway and stared and decided, when the time came, to say what he had seen. It ended, as these things often do, not with a bang, but with the slow, accumulated weight of documentation. That is less cinematic. It is also, in its way, more powerful, because it means the record exists, because it means the next person who files a complaint with the Professional Standards Unit of the Belleville Police Service will find, in the file, that this has been done before, and that it was found to matter. Because systems change, when they change at all, through exactly this kind of pressure, specific, documented, persistent, unafraid. Ngozi Ferreira Obi, for her part, did eventually ask her daughter what had happened that afternoon. Not that night, when Chiamaka was quiet in the way she gets quiet when she is processing something, but a few weeks later, when the complaint had been filed and the investigation opened, and some of the weight of the immediate had lifted. Chiamaka told her, She told her all of it. The cruiser lights, the sidewalk, the handcuffs, the phone call, the expression on Constable Price's face when he understood what he had done. Ngozi Ferreira Obi listened without interrupting. When her daughter finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Were you scared?" she asked. Chiamaka thought about it. "Not of them," she said. "No." Her mother nodded slowly, as if this was both the answer she had expected and the answer she had needed to hear. "Good," she said. Then she reached over and patted her daughter's hand once, firmly, in the way that contains entire conversations, and they didn't discuss it further that evening. But Ngozi thought about it, later, in the way that mothers think about things their children have been through. Quietly, thoroughly, returning to it, the way you return to a wound to check whether it's healing. She thought about the maple trees on that street, already turned. She thought about her daughter standing on a sidewalk in handcuffs, keeping her voice level, knowing what she knew, waiting for the moment when the knowing would matter. She thought about all the women who had stood in similar moments without that knowing, without that history, without that number in their phone. She thought about what it cost them and what it cost her and what it cost everyone who had to learn, generation by generation. That dignity is not given. It is defended, again and again, in small moments on ordinary streets, in language that is clear and calm and impossible to dismiss. She thought about all of this, and then she went to sleep, because she was 81 years old, and her hip hurt, and the news was always terrible, and her daughter was home and safe, and that, on a Tuesday in October, was what mattered most. Think for a moment about what it takes to stand calmly on a sidewalk in handcuffs and say, "You're making a mistake." Not to shout it, not to perform it for an audience, to simply say it clearly to a person who has the power to ignore it. Because it is true, and because the truth doesn't stop being true, because someone chooses not to hear it. That is not a skill that comes from a rank or a medal or a direct line to a government building in Ottawa. It comes from something older and harder and more personal than any of those things. It comes from knowing who you are clearly enough that no one else's misreading of you can shake it. It comes from the particular kind of steadiness that is forged, not found. Chiamaka Ferreira Obi had it. Millions of people who will never have her rank, her resources, or her direct line to anyone have it too. They stand on sidewalks and in lobbies and in offices and in all the ordinary places where ordinary dignity gets tested, and they hold their ground, and they say, quietly, "You're making a mistake," and they are right, and they have always been right, even when no one is there to document it. That's the part of this story worth carrying with you. If it moved you, if it made you think, if there's someone in your life who needs to hear it, share it. And if you have a story of your own, leave it in the comments. We read them, everyone.